Hey everyone, I'm rather incoherent, and I wanted to give a brief review of the Scarlet Keys cards that I've played with so far. Alright, I'm gonna be honest, it's probably not gonna be that brief, it's gonna be like an hour-long video. And I'm sorry if my voice sounds a little bit off, I've been getting a bit sick, it's winter, it happens. So far, I've gotten out all of the cards from the Scarlet Keys, and all the ones I haven't played with yet are in the middle. At the end of the video, I'll go through these cards and give rapid-fire opinions on them. But those aren't going to be really informed opinions so much as initial thoughts by looking at them. There are also a couple of cards that are so bad I didn't leave them in the middle because I don't need to play them to know that I'm never going to put them in a deck and feel good about it. As for the cards I played with a little bit over a third of the set, and I've split them into groups based on what they had in common, because usually when you play one card, there's a whole package of new cards that go with it. And I'll be starting with Vincent Lee. He's the new Seeker, he's got 3-4-3-1 as his stat line, which defensively is only a little bit better than Joe Diamond. And 4 book 3 Fist implies that he wants to flex fight a little bit. But with only access to level 1 blue cards and 3 Fist, you're looking at someone who's kind of on par with Skids. Actually worse, because Skids has blue 2 cards, right? So already you're not very good at fighting, but then you're going to be flex fighting anyway, which is going to cost you more card slots because now you have the cards for clue finding and fighting. But on top of that, Vincent's a healer. His ability is that when he heals somebody for damage or one of their assets, he can give them on the mend, which is just unexpected courage, basically. So in addition to the cost of cards for flex slots, he has the cost of cards for healing, and his star it's fine. It's heal something for 1, not the biggest deal, but it's something. There are people that don't have stars, and this is better than that. So the first thing I need to talk about when I talk about Vincent is how I've seen him played. I've got a person at my table who loves playing people like Calvin. He's played Vincent twice now. He likes playing characters that look like they can be built very many different ways and then trying out different builds on them each time. But so far, he's never even attempted to play Vincent Lee as even a flex fighter. And the reason for that is because you have access to 4 book and Seeker 3 cards, and also 3 Fist and blue 1 cards. In that situation, your abilities as a Guardian are so much worse than your abilities as a Seeker that overall the character is going to be better if you just play as a 4 book Seeker. Because swinging a machete at 4 base or a bone saw at 5 base is just not particularly good fighting. So even though his stat line makes it look like you want to play him as a flex character, in our experience, we've seen no compelling reason to do that, and because the card slots are so tight with Seeker 3, Survivor 1, Blue 1, you need to heal, you need to get clues, we don't even know what we'd be cutting to try to fit those cards in the first place. Coming over to his signature asset, the Bonesaw, he has Heal for 5, Test Book 4, if you fail, that investigator suffers 1 physical trauma. Now, the good news about this is that we didn't realize this while we were playing, even if you auto-fail, you still heal the 5 damage. However, we also never auto-failed, we never got the auto-fail into physical trauma that everyone looks at and worries about when they see this card. And as for its fighting abilities, you're essentially swinging at 5 for 2, you do take a damage to do so, which won't really matter because you're Vincent, you have healing cards, unless the Wounded Bystander's in play, which means that you basically just can't use the Bonesaw. But in our experience, the Bonesaw was never that good at fighting either. You're only swinging at like +2 against an Acolyte, so even if you put the Bonesaw out, bad dice can just result in you never killing something, because you're not actually good at fighting, you're only totaling 5. And that's exactly what we saw. One of the few times that Vincent was like, I've got the Bonesaw, I'm gonna be responsible for myself, I'm not gonna make anyone else handle me. And they tried to go to a location that had clues and kill the Acolyte. And after 2 turns of auto-fails, -6s, so on and so forth, I finally was like, look, I'm gonna come over there and help you out, because I can't let this keep happening. They had taken multiple points of damage from the Acolyte. They had done nothing for 2 turns. Because that's what you're risking when you say that you're a flex character that can fight with just 5 Fist. Wounded Bystander is his signature weakness. If this was an older expansion, it probably would have taken up an ally slot. I'm very glad that it doesn't. It's going to interplay with 3 damage on it. Anytime you take any amount of damage, you have to assign 1 here unless it was direct damage, and if it dies, you get a mental trauma. And because of Wounded Bystander, Surgical Kit is the unofficial signature card of Vincent. That double action heal 3 damage on an investigator or ally asset is exactly enough to heal off a Wounded Bystander after you draw it. And as it turns out, if you have already taken a damage on it, that's fine. You can use the other much less good reaction on Surgical Kit to heal an additional damage. And that sucks that you didn't get to draw a card and heal a horror instead, but it's fine. And when you look at all the cards that heal, most of them just say heal or heal damage from an investigator. And until very recently, I thought heal was a vague term that meant you could heal assets. It's not, it's shorthand for heal an investigator. That's in the rules errata somewhere. which means there are very, very few cards that actually fix Wounded Bystander. The only one that comes to mind immediately is Hallowed Mirror. I know for a fact Archive of Conduits, for instance, which is the best healing card in the game, cannot fix the Wounded Bystander. Coming back to the Surgical Kit though, I think outside of Vincent, this will never see play. You have to have a very strong incentive to be running healing cards, and then access to those healing cards for Surgical Kit to be good. Handing out Unexpected Courage is a pretty good incentive, and then Vincent has access to like Bandages 0 and Hallowed Mirror 3, really, really good healing cards. So Surgical Kit does end up being good enough in Vincent to run, especially because you just need it to deal with his weakness. We've seen Grey's Anatomy as well at this point. Test one book, and then you pick a card at your location. The next time it will be healed, it heals +1 damage or horror up to a max of 3, or the next time it will be dealt damage, deal +1 damage up to a max of +3. And this is for each point you succeed by. That's what's determining how much you do. And Grey's Anatomy, when you're using it to deal 3 damage to 4 health enemies on like turn 1 before your fighters are fully set up, feels really good. But what doesn't feel good is spending 5 experience, 3 resources, and a card in Seeker to help someone else do their job. And in particular, this falls into a very awkward spot, where while this card technically does work against all enemies, because it triggers attacks of opportunity against massive boss enemies, you can't use this without eating attacks of opportunity, and that's really unfortunate. I don't think Grey's Anatomy is bad by any stretch of the imagination, but if you compare it to like every other way to spend 5 experience in Seeker, like if you bought this and you haven't upgraded deductions, that's just a mistake. There are so many better things to do with 5 experience than buy Grey's Anatomy. So even though it's a good card, the cost of it's just much too high to really seriously consider if you're trying to build an optimal deck. Now, let's get back to Vincent as a whole. What did I think about him? I think that Bandages combined with Surgical Kit is awesome. I think the amount of passive healing that can trigger is absolutely ridiculous. I think handing out on the mids, especially if you have like a green character that benefits from over-succeeding because of Lucky Cigarette Case 3, that's really helpful because it either gets them through a hard test or searches their deck better. I think that fundamentally what he's doing seems pretty good. However, in playing with him, we've consistently found ourselves in spots where everyone felt like they were doing a lot, but we also were like almost failing. We were really close to not having enough tempo to succeed. And a lot of the time when Vincent was seeing play, we were running it with Hallowed Mirror, we were running it with Archive of Conduits. We weren't just doing Bandages Surgical Kit. We weren't running Garish. We weren't running the passive healing set. We were running the active healing set. And I think if you play active healing on Vincent, you're really, really slowing down your tempo. You feel like you're doing stuff and you look like you're doing stuff, but in reality, what you're doing is you're letting your Mark cut Brother Xavier and Hallowed Mirror, and then instead of running those cards, he runs other stuff and you heal him. But it would be way, way better if Mark ran those cards and you used your actions to find clues. I find that all of the active forms of healing in Vincent slowly and almost secretly take away huge amounts of tempo from you, because you don't feel like you're losing tempo, you feel like you're doing something. And something else that I think is happening that's a lot harder to see is when you spend 6 experience on Surgical Kit, now you have 2 cards and 4 resources and 6 experience that are going away from doing your job as a Clover. Because sure, he's a support character, but after the support character, the way we've been playing him as main Clover that also heals. And when you have this taking away experience and card slots and resources and time from that, it's hard to see, but at some point later in the scenario, when you have Hallowed Mirror in play and Surgical Kit in play and Bandages in play, all of those were great cards, right? That's an entire turn that you didn't find clues. Every other Seeker is just a turn ahead of you at that point. So all of this healing stuff is slowly but surely sapping tempo away from Vincent Lee. And he's not a bad character by any stretch of the imagination, but he is the easiest character to feel like you're really contributing while secretly holding your team back. I don't think Vincent will ever feel bad to play, but you might find yourself struggling with him and you don't know why. I think he's good. I don't think he's bad at all, but I don't think he's great, and I think almost all the characters in Arkham Horror are good or better. And that means that even though Vincent is good, it still leaves him relatively towards the bottom of the pack in my opinion. Next up, I want to talk about the newly printed clue-dropping archetype that came with this. Initially, you might think that because Research Notes is an evidence card, this is an archetype printed for Daryl, and I built a clue-dropping deck for Daryl. But then I realized the most important thing in that entire archetype was using an action on a book. So I made it a Daisy deck instead. And I can confidently say that I think Clue Dropper Daisy is one of the strongest characters in the game. And I need to talk about the whole archetype, its pros and its cons, so that I can justify why that is. First, I want to talk about a couple of things that are much more tangentially related, which is this stuff over here on the left. Grim Memoir is an insane card specifically in Daisy, but it's also pretty good in Rex. In Daisy, this is Lightning Bolt Investigate, get +2, which is basically succeed, because you're already at 5 book with other boosts, presumably. And then if you succeed by 2 or more, you may draw 1 card. So Grim Memoir is very high tempo in specifically Daisy. In Rex, it helps you trigger his ability, and in both, it gives you good reason to use Ariadne's Twine on it, which then allows you to more smoothly build into Ariadne's Twine combos with things like the Eon Chart 4. Grim Memoir is a really good card in specific homes, and everywhere else it's just kind of okay. Next up, let's talk about the Ravenquill. When you purchase it, you name a tome or spell asset, and then when you play it as a 3-cost event, you're going to attach it to that asset. Then when you resign, you either mark a checkbox on the quill, or you reduce the experience to upgrade that asset by 1. So basically, it's going to slowly upgrade itself. There is a little bit of free experience you can get on certain books, but if you're using it for something like research notes, it's just upgrading itself. When you come to the Ravenquill's upgrades, I won't be talking about every upgrade when I look at these. I think that just takes way too much time. So I'm going to talk about the main thing that I think these do with regards to the upgrades. And the main thing the Ravenquill does, like, you need Supernatural Record if you're running this. Because if you're running this, you don't have room for a research library, and there's too much heat shit in your deck at that point. So you're going to have to check off Supernatural Record eventually. But the big thing it's doing is giving you Spectral Binding. The attached asset doesn't take up any slots. You're using 1 card to essentially get the benefits you cared about from both Research Librarian and Arcane Enlightenment. And that matters a lot in Daisy, because in Daisy you have 2 copies of Research Notes, the Necronomicon Weakness, and potentially several other books. Coming over to my final deck that I was using in the Scarlet Keys, you can see that I also had Occult Lexicon 3 and 2 Old Books of Lore. And I mean, you're Daisy. Old Book of Lore is one of the best cards in Daisy. This helps you set up. And with 13 assets, most of which you want to get into play, having the Old Book of Lore really helps get through that setup phase. So the big benefit of the Ravenquill is that it allows you to very easily get the hand slots to play your second Research Notes. You don't have to draw Daisy's tote bag. You have a second hit now where you're able to play both Research Notes without fear of drawing Necronomicon and discarding one of them. And then eventually when you have both out, you're able to have the Occult Lexicon and an Old Book of Lore and both Research Notes, and unfortunately the Necronomicon, because let's be honest, you never have time to take 3 horror and skip your turn. Especially in a Seeker where you draw super fast and eventually you're going to redraw the Necronomicon anyway. So the Ravenquill is not a card that I think is particularly strong. As far as 6 experience cards go, tutor a card, it doesn't take a slot is a pretty cool effect, but in specifically Seeker for a book, it's actually not that good. But because it saves card slots and it upgrades itself, I do think it has a home in this deck type. Empirical Hypothesis is a card I looked at and I thought, oh wow, this is incredible. And in Daryl it is, because you just need cards to gain evidence in Daryl. But if you're trying to actually use Empirical Hypothesis, it seems to me like regardless of which upgrades you took, it's very likely drawing you about 1 card a turn. I think if you have Peer Review as well as the one for entering a 3-shroud location, then later in the game, it'll probably start averaging more like 1.5 to 2 cards. And when you look at all the things you can do with your evidence instead, spend 2 evidence, emergency cache. Spend 3 evidence, discover a clue. Legitimately, I think all of the alternative ways of spending your evidence are less value than just drawing cards in a Seeker deck. So I don't think those improve it at all. So even with like Peer Review, Alternative Hypothesis, and Field Research, you're 70 XP deep into this card and now it's slightly better. My main opinion on Empirical Hypothesis is that Seekers have too much draw to spend an action and 2 resources setting up a slow draw engine. Rather than doing this, you can just run the normal Seeker cards and you'll be just fine. And this can really heavily impede your early tempo when you're playing with it. It's not a bad card, but it does feel much worse than the alternative draw methods available to Seeker. And all of the experience options don't really push it to a level where I think it starts competing with things like Deep Knowledge, Cryptic Research, etc. And now we can come over to the main thing I want to talk about with Seekers, the clue dropping archetype. In the past, we've had cards like Quick Study, where dropping a clue wasn't ever worth it, because there's nothing you can get out of it that's worth more than getting the clue back. So you end up in a spot where the cost was universally too much. You're here to get clues. You can't drop clues to do something else. That's the opposite of what the character's supposed to do. However, research notes and press pass change this. If you have a research notes out, then eventually you can test the research notes to get all the clues you dropped. So now instead of dropping a clue, it's net 0 eventually. However, if you have 2 copies of research notes out, they're both going to gain evidence. So now instead of dropping a clue, you're gaining a clue in the future. Press pass, when you drop a clue, you're going to get an action the next time you have actions, whether it's the next turn or right now. It also works on spending a clue. That didn't need to be there, it just makes the card a little bit better for no reason, but it does. So you have these cards really heavily encouraging you to drop stuff. So now instead of fail to do your job, get +3 skill value, this says get +3 skill value, get a clue later, gain an action. And suddenly, Quick Study has went from being very clearly not worth it to being one of the best cards in the game in this archetype. However, you're noticing the problem here. I need Quick Study, I need both research notes, I won't press pass, I want the second Quick Study, I really want the Mailsin. Let's talk about Mailsin. Mailsin is why I think Daisy clue dropping is one of the best decks in the game. Because this gives you Gloria levels of control over the Mythos deck as a reaction ability, and the cost is that you're gonna get an action and gain clues. There is no other card in the deck where someone draws an elite enemy from the Mythos deck, and then you put it in the discard pile as though you had killed it and they draw something else. Mailsin doesn't care if it's a treachery or a monster, it doesn't care if it's non-elite, it just lets you kill one Mythos card every turn. Usually that means you get rid of a Mythos card that someone drew and couldn't handle. Someone had 1 head, 5 brain, and they drew Rotting Remains, Mailsin rerolls that. But if that doesn't happen, you get to the last person, they still don't need it, you use Mailsin anyway. Sure, there's the infinitesimal chance you give them a Surge card and that's gonna suck. But if you give them anything else, they just discard the one that's worse. Maybe they got a slightly softer Mythos phase, or maybe they just drew an enemy and then discarded that enemy so that now you don't have to deal with it. Mailsin's Lightning Bolt was essentially this cycle of the Mythos deck. You have 1 less enemy in the deck. That's 1 less action tax on your fighter, more time that they can spend doing other things and playing for the objectives. Mailsin is incredibly strong, but you end up in this situation where you have Mailsin, Quick Study, Research Notes, Press Pass. You have all of this that is core to your deck. And you're still playing like Old Book of Lore to try to get them out faster. You still have other assets in your deck, not just these. So the problem with clue dropping is that you really want all 6 of these assets in play, and you need both copies of research notes and a trigger for them, or a research note and a press pass and a trigger for them very badly for the archetype to start being good. So you end up in a situation where because you need them so quickly, draw becomes incredibly important. The archetype just isn't working without multiple pieces at once, so you're running Deep Knowledges and Old Book of Lore and Daisy and all this other stuff. And your deck is just drawing cards and playing assets until all the pieces get there. So it's a very low tempo start. Don't get me wrong, if you're in a scenario that needs tempo, you can still just mulligan for Practice Makes Perfect and hit Deduction level 2. It's still a Seeker 5 deck, you're still doing broken Seeker stuff. But a lot of your early experience has to go towards setting this up, and your early turns in a given scenario are spent drawing these cards and playing them. So the weakness of this archetype is that even in Daisy, where once you're online, you're taking 4 action turns and you're investigating for like X clues, which is very regularly going to be more than 3 at a time. Like, you're doing really strong stuff, don't get me wrong, but the setup time does hold it back a pretty good amount. However, because Mailsin is absolutely nuts, it's such a strong support deck that I do consider it to be one of the best decks in the game. And of course, these aren't just the only ways to drop clues, we have others. We have Analysis, a practice card for your Practice Makes Perfect that is going to say drop a clue, reroll the autofill. Or, more than once, I played Analysis, passed the test, and re-rolled it repeatedly. I had like 4 clues on me, I passed the test, I re-rolled it, I passed the test again, I re-rolled it, and then when I had 2 clues left, I was like, I'll keep this success, I don't want to get stuck on an autofill by being unlucky. Because you just want to drop clues to build up these research notes, because you're already investigating with the research note, that's the thing. If you drop a clue while investigating with research notes, and you know you're passing by enough to pick the clue back up anyway, there's literally no downside to re-rolling, so you can keep dropping clues to put points on the other research notes. Captivating Discovery is the best draw card in the game because it says draw 6, get 3 clues later. That's not actually what it says, but once you're playing it, that tends to be what it says. However, it does take a while to do that. It's one of the few draw cards in the game that you can't play on turn 1 when you need your draw cards the most. Bizarre Diagnosis is the new clue-dropping healing card, and like many healing cards, it's just not that good. If you have the archetype set up, this is basically spending an action to gain a clue and heal someone for 3. But there are so many cards between Practice Makes Perfect and the archetype you're running that Bizarre Diagnosis is immediately eating into the free card slots that you have. So to me, I think Bizarre Diagnosis was printed so that Vincent decks could feel like all the new Seeker cards were printed for them, when in reality they were printed for Daryl. That's why they all cost 2 or less experience, which is sad. Because all this new stuff really isn't for Vincent. Next up we have Kaimani Jones, and she is the roguiest rogue to have ever rogued. I've never felt like I was playing a greener character than this. The only counter argument to that is that she has 3 head instead of 1 or 2 like most of the rogues. But everything she does is a Foot Matters archetype relying on incredibly rogue flavored cards. And thematically, I really enjoyed playing her. In terms of how she felt to play, she was super fun and engaging, but I also think she has a lot of problems, and ultimately, while she is a great character, is not anywhere near that top tier of investigators. And the big reason that she isn't is action inefficiency and setup time. Her ability to kill enemies by evading them a second time is cool, and it allows her to fight with her foot immediately, but the reality is that without foot boost, 5 foot isn't consistently dodging most enemies. And since most enemies have at least 2 health, adding your book is the second test, same as the first, and if they have more than 2 health, then it's getting harder. So you need to be playing setup assets that get you more foot, and green really doesn't actually have that many of those. You could fill your hand with the dissection kits that came with the Seeker cards, but you already need to be filling your hands with Thieves kits and illicit weapons to do your job, whether that's flex or fight. And because of her action inefficiency when it came to evading and killing enemies, where you have to engage them off of the guy who drew them, then dodge them, and then dodge them again, and your turn is over, hopefully you didn't fail any of those rolls, I found that I never had the time to set up both clue finding and fighting assets. After the first scenario, I was like, yeah, that doesn't work, and immediately switched hard into being pure fighter and let our flex characters go harder into clues. And the action inefficiency of that never really goes away. The only time that her ability starts feeling action efficient is when you start getting to use it alongside Stealth 3, which is a lightning bolt evade attempt at -2 difficulty that you can still use her reaction on, and that's a very cool, very powerful synergy, but until that happens, her ability is just so action inefficient. If someone at another location draws an enemy, most characters can walk there, swing, and kill it by swinging over with 2 actions. Kaimani, without a gun in play yet, physically cannot kill them. You can walk there, engage, and evade. You can't actually do the second evade. And I know I said without a gun in play, and the other guy obviously already had a gun. However, it's very important to note, the other guy didn't pretend that his ability let him fight without playing guns. So even though I do think Kaimani's very strong, because of things I'm going to be getting into in a little bit, I don't think that their ability is as good as it seems on the surface, and I do think they have serious tempo problems to the point that it prevents them from being a flex and holds them back from being a fighter. Grappling Hook is theoretically really good because it lets you evade an enemy, then move, and then investigate, all with your foot, so it's getting a clue. However, as a 3-cost hand asset, it's got a lot of competition with the things you're using to kill people. You can easily fill your hands with a Switchblade and a 25, and if you're doing the flex thing, then you can throw Thieves kits and lockpicks on the list, and there's just no shortage of reasons why Grappling Hook doesn't have the ability to be played, not the least of which is because it's actually pretty hard to increase your foot as a mono green character. I really want to just hold it as a bad manual dexterity, because I will very frequently find myself needing that. And Agent Fletcher is one of the funniest weaknesses in the game for me, partly because his text is nonsense. While Kaimani Jones' evading Agent Fletcher reduced their book value to 0. If you read this before Kaimani, you just think you had a stroke and have to reread it a couple of times. But he's a basic 2/3/3 enemy that hits for 1/1, Prey Kaimani only, alert hunter. It's what you'd expect this to be, and when you try to evade him to kill him, you're gonna have a problem, so you really won't be using a Switchblade or something. Just beat him to death through that 2-fist. However, in scenario 1, it's actually really hard to deal with this guy. You're not good at fighting in scenario 1, and if you draw him early, it can be a huge problem. But by scenario 8, at some point, our flex character asked me, hey, you have a lot of enemies on you. Do you want me to kill Agent Fletcher for you or something? And I laughed and said, oh no, don't kill Agent Fletcher. I'm humiliating him, he's benefiting me. Because every single turn I would evade Agent Fletcher with 2 copies of pickpocketing and a lucky cigarette case as the first thing that I did. And then I would draw cards and gain resources and use them to play other events. And then I would Lightning Bolt re-engage him and play Honed Instinct with its ability Killer Instinct to get 2 more actions. Like, he was just triggering all my abilities. He was technically making the fight I was currently in harder, but after I killed all the other enemies, I just kept Agent Fletcher with me for the entire final scenario. It's like, yeah, no, I'm dragging him around. I would evade him, Lightning Bolt re-engage him, then walk with him to the next location to guarantee I had somebody with me to trigger pickpocketing on every single turn. Because once you're fully set up in this deck, you have so many actions that it feels like you're just making up things until the turn ends and everyone's dead. And I think that difference between Scenario 1 early Kaimani, where in the first half of the first scenario, you're struggling to even find the actions to kill an enemy with anything, and then the last half of the last scenario, you're like, I need this enemy to live just so that I have somebody to humiliate to gain resources. Kaimani is a setup character, unfortunately, and there's not really a way to avoid that. However, the good thing for Kaimani is they're guaranteed to have some way to deal with enemies, even if it's inefficient in the early turns. And then, because Underworld Market exists, they're guaranteed to find their weapons within the first 5 turns as they go through the Underworld deck. And Kaimani is the one rogue that starts with 5 experience. And then within the thick of it, that's 8. So you can buy Underworld Market and Dirty Fighting in your first scenario, guaranteeing that when you fight an evaded enemy, you get +2 to your skills against them, including trying to kill them with Kaimani's ability, or just punching them normally. And Dirty Fighting and Underworld Market are a package that does a lot to help a lot of green characters. These 2 cards feel like the savior of the big failed rogue archetype, where you try to fight with foot and you just play a janky pile of garbage. And these let you make that archetype function to a really high degree. They're core cards in Kaimani and core cards and a lot of jankier green fighting decks that now actually work. But the big difference between Kaimani and, say, a Fighter Finn or a Fighter Skids doing this stuff is that Kaimani starts with the experience to buy those cards. Kaimani has 5 foot, and an ability to kill those enemies with her foot before she draws them from the Underworld Market. So those other characters on turn 2 might not have their weapon, whereas Kaimani can still kill them. A Finn without a weapon would just be without a weapon and unable to kill them. And in Scenario 1, Kaimani actually has all of this, whereas with Finn and Skids and any other green fighter doing this, you have to draw your Dirty Fighting the hard way, provided you even got it within the thick of it in the first place. So for me, I really like Kaimani, Dirty Fighting, and Underworld Market. Even though as a deck, this has a lot of setup and it can be pretty slow and awkward at places, I think these 3 cards are some of the best combination of mechanics and flavor for rogues that has ever been in Arkham. And in particular, I love Underworld Market plus Dirty Fighting to enable a lot of the failed green fighting stuff from the past. On the subject of Underworld Market, let's talk about all these new illicit cards. I'll take that as the odd one out here, because though it's illicit, it's also an economy card, which means you don't want to be spending resources to get this. However, because green has adaptable, there's a lot of situations where you can adaptable this into your deck, whether it's your normal deck or the Underworld Market, and then play it because you knew you would be seeing a lot of humanoids. So while I think I'll Take That is probably the worst green economy card, it's a great example of a green card that you can use adaptable to play for just one scenario and feel good about, if you have the meta knowledge to use adaptable well. Because fast, play an item, reduce its cost by the amount you succeeded your evade by, is pretty good if you have a deck with illicit items, or sorry, item assets in general, and if you have the ability to evade enemies, which like you're a rogue, you probably do. Especially with this new archetype really encouraging the high foot playstyle. So while I think I'll Take That is a very niche card, I absolutely have played it with Kaimani, where I use adaptable to slot it in because I knew I was playing a scenario where I was going to have to deal with humanoid enemies right away. Green cards are unique to me in that you can print a level 0 super niche card, and rather than saying this is too niche, you should never play it, with green specifically, you can say, oh yeah, there's a reason to play this because of adaptable. Coming over to Thieves Kit, this is a godsend for any green character that was getting clues. Like Lockpicks, Thieves Kit can go into your Underworld Market to consistently hit the cards you need to do your job. But Thieves Kit, unlike Lockpicks, only has 6 uses, but it also gives you resources, making it better in big money. I really like the Thieves Kit. I think it helps out a green archetype that struggled a little bit before, and it's a really good card. The upgraded Thieves kit I'm pretty lukewarm on. Obviously, it's better, you get +1 to the test, and you get 2 resources if you exceed by 2 or more. So in a big money deck, where you can reliably get this extra money, you're going to be up to 9 resources instead of up 3 at the end of it, so yes, it's obviously better. But green has a unique problem. Green characters can spend an unlimited amount of experience, and spending 3 experience on this seems really hard to justify. I can't really imagine that I'll ever be in a situation where I upgrade this, because instead of upgrading my Thieves kits, I could have bought an ace in the hole. There's just like always something else you can do. Next, I'm going to talk about Embezzled Treasure. Embezzled Treasure is basically just letting you give up resources at the end of a scenario in exchange for resources at the beginning of the next scenario, which essentially makes it a very, very high tempo card if you're able to use it. Because I played it in a Kaimani deck that wasn't a particularly big money deck, like I had a lot of economy cards, but not any synergy cards for the economy. It was just to fund all of my assets. I found it incredibly helpful. I find this to be like arguably just better than Another Day, Another Dollar, because it doesn't cost you 3 experience and it can give you 5 resources up from 2. It does a lot. And like Another Day, Another Dollar, it's just gonna sit in your underworld market. You don't have to draw it. You're only gonna draw this if you decide you want to. So the fact that it's not taking up a slot in your deck makes it a lot more playable than it would have been without Underworld Market. The big issue with it is without a really, really high economy big money deck, it's not as good. Like if you have the Black Fan in your deck, starting with 15 resources is a huge deal, because now the Black Fan's coming online a lot faster. But if you're just playing a deck where you have a lot of cost, Embezzled Treasure's not so good. And especially in Kaimani, where I was constantly stressed for actions and playing other things, I found it very hard to get Embezzled Treasure working. I think Embezzled Treasure is an absolutely nuts card in conjunction with Underworld Market, but it didn't perform to the level that I expect out of it with Kaimani. And I don't know if that's because I'm overrating Embezzled Treasure, or because Kaimani didn't have enough economy in their deck and enough action spare to really make use of this. I think it's the latter, but I could be wrong. And lastly, let's talk about Honed Instinct. Initially, this isn't that good. It's fast, 1 cost, you get an action when the agenda or act advances, or when you succeed by 3 or more. However, as a fighter, you can get Killer Instinct. Add the following play condition, an enemy engages you, which essentially just says now you can play this whenever you would ever conceivably want another action. You can also take Force of Habit here at the bottom, where you get 2 actions instead of 1 and you remove it from the game. You can take Impulse Control, where for 3 experience, it's getting -1 cost and you're getting a 3rd copy. But essentially, as you upgrade this, it's going to give you more actions or more copies for free, or more ease to trigger it with. And in its initial form, I find it to be not great. It's fine. You're eventually going to find a way to trade 1 resource, 1 card for an action, which isn't a terrible deal, but that's just worse quick thinking, except you're guaranteed to get the action, so it's sort of a side grade to quick thinking when you have the base version. But quick thinking is a good card, so that's not a terrible place to live. When you get Killer Instinct, it gets a lot better because now you're reliably getting it when you need the actions. Then you get Impulse Control, and once you have 3 of them at 0 cost, it starts being a lot easier to find ways to use this. But I'm of the opinion that even though it's really, really good once you have the 9 experience version with Force of Habit and you're getting 2 actions instead of 1, Rogue can spend infinite experience. So while I had a good time with Honed Instinct, like I could have spent 9 experience on something else and it would probably have also been really good. So even though Honed Instinct is a good card, I don't think it's particularly crazy. On the whole, I don't think Honed Instinct is great. I think it's good. I think it's a side grade to quick thinking at first, and eventually you spend some more experience and you start having more control over when it goes off. Eventually it gets better when it goes off. But this is a card where I'm hard pressed to say that it's better than spending my experience on something else. It's so close to being a great and busted card, but I feel like it's actually pretty balanced. And when I'm building my deck, I'm not looking for cards that are pretty balanced. I'm looking for the busted shit. Which brings us to our last 3 sets of cards. A couple of cards I've seen played that don't really fit neatly into an archetype, a pile of cards that I don't feel I need to see them play to have opinions on them, and Daryl / the difficulty 0 archetype, where I haven't played it yet, but I have planned out my deck for a Dream Eaters rerun we'll be doing, and I'll be playing Daryl in it, and I have some things to say based on theory crafted along. Let's deal with the ones I've seen it play at first. At a Crossroads, Natured Beast. These cards are absolutely nuts, and every single character where Survivor 1 just got a buff. At a Crossroads says one of two things. Anyone on the map can play Deep Knowledge for themselves, except they don't add curse tokens. Which, like, Deep Knowledge is a card I would buy at 1 experience. So this is great in a class that doesn't have Deep Knowledge. But if somehow, some way, no one wants to give up an action to play Deep Knowledge, first off, congratulations, it sounds like you're winning. But second off, then surely somebody is fine with discarding a random card and taking an action now. There's never a situation where At a Crossroads is going to be bad, and it's very frequently just great. It's very frequently better Deep Knowledge. Now, you might look at Nature of the Beast and read it as draw an encounter card and then get a clue. And you think to yourself, but I don't run Draw into the Flame, and that's draw an encounter card, get 2 clues, which is better. That is the wrong way to read Nature of the Beast. Nature of the Beast will sometimes whiff, and there won't even be clues on the map, which is unfortunate, but usually this does just get a clue when you draw it. The significant difference in Nature of the Beast and Draw into the Flame is that drawing an encounter card on this is not a cost, it's a benefit. Because you're not drawing a random card, you're drawing the top 3 and picking one and then picking who draws it. If you find yourself in a situation where drawing 3 cards in the encounter deck, you can't find an investigator on your team who can easily eat one of them, then you are so screwed. Because in almost every situation, this is an upside. You draw 3 cards and you see something like Rotting Remains, Ancient Evils, and an enemy. Cool, Ancient Evils is out. Does anyone have the ability to soak horror? Or does anyone have the ability to kill an enemy easily? Because almost every time, you just discarded Ancient Evils, and now somebody with 5 head takes a Rotting Remain test, or somebody who was the fighter and didn't have that much to do this turn is going to kill something. This is no action, gain a clue, discard 2 Mythos cards, and give the last one to somebody who can easily handle it. So yeah, on the whole, I think Nature of the Beast is nuts. I think it is a card where it was printed with the idea that the top half is a cost and not a benefit. And I think this card is easily worth 2 experience, maybe even 3. It's a very, very good card. This isn't going to be a comprehensive review of Runic Axe. Unlike most of them where I'm setting them in a pile, I'm going to put this back on the board once I'm done talking about it. Runic Axe, we've played with enough to know it's not for main fighters. As a main fighter, you can very easily bottom out of charges with a weapon that takes up both your hand slots and find yourself really regretting running this. What this is great for is flex fighters. Because as a flex fighter, the accuracy is boosting your presumably worst fist by +3 total, which is huge. And the fact that you have limited charges replenishing every round isn't as big of a deal because you're not expected to have to fight every round. So Runic Axe is way worse if you play it on fighter characters, but pretty great on flex characters is my initial impression of it. But I still need to see it played on flex characters to confidently say that. Guard Dog 2 is a card I played with well before this came out. It's an incredible card. 4-2 Soak is substantially better than 3-1 Soak. For 2 experience on its own, that's almost enough. Because the text now works on horror, you go from 3 reflected damage to 5 reflected damage, which is a lot better. And this is assuming, of course, that you're putting 1 damage on Guard Dog at a time, that you have the leisure to do that, but generally speaking, with Guard Dog, you find a way to make that happen. But it also gets the Lightning Bolt ability to engage an enemy at your location at the cost of them attacking you. There are a huge number of enemies that don't even hit that hard, where this is just Lightning Bolt engage and you don't even notice the damage. But also the damage can just go on the Guard Dog and deal it back to them immediately, which is great. Upgraded Guard Dog is incredible, and I said when I was playtesting the version of it before it got released in Scarlet Keys, my only gripe with this card is that it should be a 3-cost blue-red card for Daniela, because it's a little bit powerful at 2 experience, and it's a damn shame that Daniela can't get it. So I'm sad to see Daniela doesn't get the new Guard Dog, but that doesn't make the new Guard Dog anything less than incredible. Predator or Prey, we thought was going to be really good, because that revelation if there are no enemies in play draw 1 card, but it seemed like either it doesn't exist and you thin your deck and it's fine, or you have an enemy on the board and this helps you deal with them. But you very frequently find yourself in a situation where there are no unengaged enemies on the board, which means you have to pick the second option, which is disengage from each enemy and move once away from them. Which very likely means your fighter gets disengaged from what he's fighting, and then everyone gets pushed off of their location where they were doing something that mattered, and that's why they were there. So unfortunately, Predator or Prey in our experience has been consistently terrible. with one exception. If you read this card, it doesn't say non-elites. So, each unengaged enemy moves once towards the nearest investigator, can pull elite enemies off of locations they're supposed to be at. Which just seems like an errata mistake to me that's gonna get fixed, because yeah, that just breaks some scenarios in half. At least once in the Scarlet Keys, this basically broke a scenario where something that was supposed to be challenging became utterly trivial. And I think that's probably the normal experience with this card. You play with it, it screws you over constantly, and it might break a scenario depending on when you draw it. And then we're left with Refine. Refine costs 2 actions for 1 experience. You can only play it once per game for each investigator, so no one can play both Refines on their own. I think it's a fair cost. But in general, I don't think the game is balanced around bonus experience. So I think that if you're able to use this, you're very likely trivializing later scenarios by getting additional experience. That's my opinion on Delve Too Deep. That's my opinion on Yorick's signature card. And I'm sure if you can consistently spare the resources, the card, and the double action to play this, you'll be basically trivializing later scenarios by having too much experience. But the flip side to this is that I'm not actually convinced there are that many signature cards, or customizable cards rather, that are actually worth running, which makes Refine a lot worse because it's tied to how much you value putting experience on these cards, and most of them don't seem that great. Next, I want to talk about Daryl Simmons. I'm going to talk pretty quickly about this because I haven't gotten to see this archetype in play yet. Daryl Simmons' ability is turn an evidence into a gumption. Gumption is a new card that reduces the difficulty of a test by 2. And essentially, anything that gets evidence, such as the empirical research we saw earlier, can just be used to, instead of draw cards like it's supposed to, as a bank to hold gumptions. His signature is another way to get evidence to fuel that ability, and his weakness, Ruined Film, removes evidence, and if you can't lose that evidence, deal horror. Either way, this sucks, whether you're getting bombed for 4 horror, or losing 4 evidence that you plan on converting to power. Either way, it's gonna suck. Ruined Film is not a pleasant card to draw ever. Moving on to Daryl himself, the new old keyring at 3 experience is the same as the old one, except it has 1 more charge up from 2, and if the difficulty is reduced all the way to 0, you get an extra clue. With Daryl's ability, that gets a lot easier. And then, speaking of reducing the difficulty to 0, Shadow Light is a fast 2-cost event that you play if you're investigating and at difficulty 0. Instead of pulling from the bag, you auto-succeed, so that's not too big of a deal. It just negates autofill, basically. The big deal is that you get an additional clue at this location and an additional clue at any location. So combining this and old keyring says get 3 clues from your location, 1 clue for any location, automatically succeed, and with 1 gumption from Daryl, that can work at Shroud 4 locations, which is pretty crazy. Of course, that stops at Shroud 4 and Shroud 5 and 6 exist, so you might want to still run gumption just to hit any location with that combo. But also, because it's Daryl's abilities limit once per test but not mutually exclusive with Gumption, you can then use both Gumption and his ability on Exploit Weakness, the fight equivalent of Shadow Light. Instead of automatically succeeding and getting more clues, this one automatically succeeds and just discards the enemy, unless it's elite. If it's elite, you evade it and deal 3 damage. When I talk about not liking non-elite cards, it's because you have to still deal with elite enemies. If this just dealt 3 damage and evaded it automatically to everything, that would still be fine. Discard the attack-related enemy isn't even necessarily better because it could cost you victory points in certain situations. But yeah, this is nuts. This is like one of the best flex fighting cards in the game if you're able to reliably trigger it, which only Daryl and Quick Learner decks are going to be able to do. And Daryl's really great at this archetype because of his ability giving him more copies of Gumption. The only other way to really trigger this archetype to work super reliably is if you're running double Quick Learner, so on your 3rd and later actions, then you're going to be getting -2 difficulty on everything. But that costs 8 experience and permanence, as opposed to just being your ability. I think this archetype is really, really strong. I think you probably are best off in Daryl running just this, and you leave out the Gumption like you plan to crack the 5-6 Shroud locations with deductions and other skills, and you leave out the Exploit Weakness and let other people fight, but you can definitely run these 2 as well. And this whole thing fits into like Quick Learner Stella in a really gross way. I think Stella got a huge buff out of this because she was previously the only character that really wanted to run Quick Learner. And next time we talk about Scarlet Keys, I'll be going into a great deal of depth about these cards again, because I'm pretty sure they're wild and that Daryl and Stella are some of the best characters in the game right now. And that leaves us with this pile of cards where I don't even feel the need to test them. I don't see them ever doing anything I really care about. All of the really good Dilemma cards are the ones that they go off, and then you just immediately get value in every situation. Katja Eastbank allows you to hold them for later if you drew her first. So A, you have to draw in a certain order for her to do anything, and B, the best cards that she puts under her were the cards that were going to be good no matter what. So I don't really value what she's doing, and I have other great allies available in red. Improvised Shield is a hand slot 3-soak asset, and if there is any one thing that Survivor doesn't need help doing, it's surviving. They probably don't need this soak, and if they do, they've already got ways to get it, so I don't really see this ever getting any amount of play. Clean Sneak is a 4 experience card that I probably wouldn't play at 2 experience, because I'm gonna be honest with you, there just aren't ever that many exhausted enemies at my location. At 0 cost, fast card, what does it need to do to replace itself and be even? Just draw 1 card. But I spent 4 experience on this, so I mean, realistically, I want to see at least 2 effects from this. But 4 experience, gain 2 resources, draw a card if you've evaded 2 enemies? That doesn't even sound that good. And once we start saying if you've evaded 3 enemies, it's like, when's that triggering? What scenario are you in? How'd that happen? Do you have somebody like walking around with a bunch of handcuffed guys? How are you triggering this? Clean Sneak is just a card that doesn't work. It has too many conditions. It's good they said non-swarm, otherwise it would be complete trash everywhere except Dream Eater's website, and then in website it would be the best card in the game. But now it's just complete trash everywhere. The one well-designed part of this card is that it doesn't break in Dream Eaters. Because man, I just don't see how this is supposed to work. Triggerman is a rough card to play, because it's only going to work if you have hand assets to spare. Nothing on him says the card doesn't take up a hand asset. And you might think intuitively, well, obviously it's supposed to not take up a hand asset, but thanks to Dr. Eli Horowitz existing, we have a clear precedent that it has to specify it doesn't take up hand slots when you attach it to something like this. So, yeah, you share hands with the Trigger Man. And if you were willing to commit your hand assets to holding a gun, I imagine you were willing to commit your turns to shooting it normally, and you didn't need the Trigger Man. Tool Belt is a bad card. Bandolier is rough because you're spending resources and cards to play more assets. And you would have been better off not playing those assets, not playing the Bandolier, and having those cards be something else. But with Tool Belt, it's even worse because the extra assets become blank and don't do anything. I don't know what kind of deck you have to be playing for Tool Belt to actually be good. And I'm not going to think too hard about it, because odds are if it is actually good, it's because it's enabling some broken combo that's going to get tabooed. And I'm pretty confident that it's just terrible. Flashlight 2 is an upgrade to a card I haven't ran since the core set. And looking at it, while test -2 difficulty seems nice because there aren't that many ways to boost your evading, at the end of the day, my hand slots are super valuable, and this costs 3 experience, and there are other things I could be doing with my hands and my experience that are probably better. Hit and Run is a card that's going to get tabooed because of the Red Glove Man, and outside of the Red Glove Man doesn't do anything, because your allies need to be in play continuously to get value. Quick Getaway is Dodge, except it's worse than Dodge. Which, I mean, part of the core screen character is getting worse version of someone else's cards, but I'm still not playing it. End of the Road is disproportionately better in Wendy Adams and Preston than anyone else, because they can take Adaptable to slot this in when they go into a scenario knowing that it only has one agenda or that you get to the final agenda very quickly. For anyone else, you're trading a card in your hand until the end of the agenda, or the final agenda rather. And then at the final agenda, this is a good card. You replace the card, gain a resource, get an action, that's very, very good. But because it's going to be weighing you down until then, it's only worth running in those few characters that can strategically move it in and out of their deck for free. When I was talking about Improvised Shield, I said that red characters had no trouble staying alive. And on that same subject, While I'm not willing to give up a hand slot to stay alive, I'm very much not willing to give up 3 cards in my hand to negate 3 damage, which is much worse than the rate you're getting for Improvised Shield, so no thank you. Lifeline's a really funny card. I'm sure there's like a specific thing you can do with Lifeline that's good. It probably involves having a Stella on the team or something. I don't know. But the reality is this is a 1 experience exile card that very, very frequently just like doesn't do anything. It gives 1 person 2 actions eventually when they get unlucky. It's just not that good. Which brings us to our last 5 cards. Existential Riddle is a way to make a non-elite enemy get evaded and stay evaded by becoming aloof. So, that's cool and all, but as a Seeker, spending experience on a card? A, enemies are not my job. Someone else is supposed to do this. B, if you're a big hand Seeker, you're definitely a clue finding Seeker, so that's doubly true. And C, this is a fight card where you help the fighter, but it only works when the fighter's not fighting the boss, which is when the fighter is most likely to need your help. So yeah, I don't know who buys Existential Riddle, when or why they do. Although I will admit, very important, this is a tech card Seekers can buy when they're going into Before the Black Throne, which is always something I like to see. Grievous Wound is actually a card I have seen played, though I haven't played it myself. In our first run, Mark Harrigan was our fighter in Scarlet Keys, and they wanted to test a bunch of the new cards on a character they knew was so strong where it wouldn't matter they were playing bad cards. And man, Grievous Wound was terrible. I don't know when Grievous Wound is supposed to be good, because this is a fast 1-cost event that you use against an enemy you've dealt damage to but not killed, that then deals 1 damage to them at the end of each round. So if you kill them with this on the first round, it's a 1-cost event that makes you get attacked to trigger its effect of dealing the final damage to an enemy. And that's like its best case scenario. I guess its real best case scenario is you end up in a scenario where you put Grievous Wound on someone and walk away and let them slowly die. Like maybe there are some scenarios that have bosses that you can cheese. Like you play a Mark deck, you draw your whole deck, you get 2 copies of Grievous Wounds. You walk up to the boss, he's gonna stay in 1 location, slap double Grievous Wound on him, and you leave. And he just bleeds to death while the rest of the team is off doing something else somewhere else. Like theoretically, that situation exists for Grievous Wound, and just like with Existential Riddle, I love that there are those weird niche situations where you might consider using this card. However, also just like Existential Riddle, this card is on the whole terrible and you should never run it in any deck, because if you are, you're running overpower that doesn't draw a card. Handcuffs 2 is an upgrade to a card that was so bad no one's ever actually had the gall to play it at my table. Now, recently someone did post an analysis showing that there are multiple campaigns where Handcuffs actually has a lot of targets, the best ones being Forgotten Age, Innsmouth, and the Scarlet Keys. And in those campaigns, you might reliably get to trigger this effect, in which case, you get to permanently evade an enemy instead of killing them as a blue character, and you spent experience to do this, and you could have just like bought a gun. So I'm not sure what we're going for. One of the players on my table mentioned that you can use the new Flute of the Outer Gods and Handcuffs on Diana Stanley to drag a humanoid around with you and make them attack other enemies, which is very funny. And very funny is on the whole my opinion of both Handcuffs and Bolas, because this is just sort of not the thing that blue does, and I don't see the benefit of doing this instead. You basically would just be picking these cards if you very specifically had a scenario where you knew you needed to evade instead of fight. And that makes them tech cards that have a home, but outside of that home, just like the last 2, they're not very good. But Bolas is maybe the funniest card in the game, because you evade a guy using your fist instead of your foot, and if you succeed, then you attach Bolas to them, provided they're not elite, because as always, no fun allowed against bosses. Anyway, that attached enemy gets easier to evade, but the big thing after that enemy moves exhausted, because it trips because it's got the Bolas. One of the flavor doesn't quite work, because they're still moving at full speed, right? It's just stopping the attack. And then they're gonna ready right afterwards and engage with you if they got to your location. So even though it's really funny that they just trip immediately every time they move if they have Bolas, it actually isn't doing very much at all, and it's kind of terrible. Like even in a scenario where you need to evade, I think I would still run Handcuffs and never run Bolas. Prepared for the Worst 2 is a card that was clearly printed for Carson Sinclair, but unfortunately, it's the kind of support you should never run. It's your job to find and play the cards in your deck that you need. If you tell your Seeker, hey, can you get No Stolen 5 to enable my combo? Something went wrong. And in the same way, if Carson is spending his experience buying this, instead of getting like Ever Vigilant 4 under a stick to the plan, like there are better support options than this. There are way better support options than this. You should be able to trust your fighters to find their weapons. So with that said, those are my impressions of the first, how many cards is this? 51 cards in the Scarlet Keys. At the start of this video, I said I would briefly give my opinions on all the cards I haven't played yet based on my first impressions just reading the card, but this video is already quite long and there are a total of 83 cards left, so I'm gonna go ahead and leave that for next time. I'm rather incoherent. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope my voice has been at least halfway tolerable because I'm congested out of my mind over here and worried about the audio quality at this point. But anyways, if you like the video, like, comment, subscribe, YouTube algorithm drill, you all know this shit. And it really does help the channel grow and I do really appreciate it. And either way, I'll see you in the next one.